I'm John Batchelor. Gordon Chang, Forbes.com, joins me. Good evening to you. We go immediately to our colleague, Stephen Yates. He is in the Great West. He has gone through a political contest. He was not successful the first time out, but many people have not been successful the first time out. This is the state of Idaho. We care a great deal about the politics of Idaho. We also call upon Stephen's experience working for the vice president in the Bush administration. And Gordon and I need Stephen right now and his intuition. So, Stephen, we appreciate and honor your domestic hat. We ask the foreign policy hat here because we've got a puzzle constructed in Shanghai in these last days between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, the two presidents of the two large nuclear powers of Asia. The puzzle is not just the energy deal signed, $400 billion over 10 years, natural gas to flow from Gazprom to China. The puzzle is that in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, but most recently off the Vietnam coast, China's acting belligerent, like a bully. My understanding is what China's doing is demonstrating to Russia, to Moscow, that it is a co-equal partner between these two and dominating Eurasia. And the only way Russia is going to respect China is if they use their sharp elbows and beat up on the tiny states around them, the way we see Russia can beat up on its tiny states in Eastern Europe. Your intuition, Stephen, does that formula sound credible? Good evening to you.
Well, good evening. I think it does sound very, very credible. We have a couple of deep narratives running at the same time in this, but I think the dominant narrative is Vladimir Putin and his theory of a Russian revival. We've seen a lot of drama and discussion about what was happening in the Eastern European theater with regard to Putin. And if you look at what his greatest dream is, it's to basically roll back elements of the Cold War, and in a way maybe even go back to rolling past Nixon's détente with China, where we tilted China allegedly into our side of the Cold War competition. And so now we have a resurgent Russia getting more active in Asia, proving that it can be a global power again, and yes, exercising a little dominion in that region and getting China to step forward in a way and prove its value to the equation. It's really a tilt back in the direction of a Moscow-Beijing Axis, undermining basically the Cold War and the post-Cold War holiday from that history, in my view.
Well, Steve, when we're looking back in history, why should we just stop with the Cold War? I mean, we could look back at the pact between Molotov and Ribbentrop. Essentially, you have two large authoritarian states, both territorially aggressive, are now getting together with this energy agreement that they signed today. And if you want to look back far enough, you can see what happens when you have these large states get together.
Absolutely. I think that basically we have been so distracted with what we've been doing inside our own country and with the seeming impotence of our foreign policy and crises in other theaters that I think we've just not wanted to look closely at the reality of what these major powers are doing. And we talk about meetings between our presidents and other kinds of efforts at diplomacy, but I think this deep narrative is, as you described, you have the power of energy and the role that it plays in allowing authoritarian states to assert an agenda without being compelled by domestic politics to open up and liberalize and have leverage over the states that are in their near abroad that depend upon those energy sources or claim it as their own, and they're taking control away. And I think when we see in the South China Sea, you have potential economic development for neighboring states and China taking away their ability to develop themselves, to have the kind of compellence over them that Russia has on Eastern Europe.
When we see what is happening today, not only in Ukraine, but also Vietnam, South China Sea, East China Sea, these events are inconceivable to people 2 years ago, maybe even a year ago. And that is the problem, and that is what we're seeing is a disintegration of the international system at a very fast pace, and clearly the Western democracies cannot keep up. And as you point out, we're so self-absorbed in what's going on in our own country, things that are really insignificant in the scheme of things, and yet the world is falling apart around us, and that's going to affect us eventually, if not before eventually.
Absolutely. I think we're seeing the consequences of what I would consider to be provocative weakness. And basically, when America is too assertive, of course, there are consequences, but when America becomes too passive, we like to talk about notions of burden sharing, but when we're talking about burden sharing, usually what we're saying is it's up to the rest of you to sort this all out. And whether we like it or not, when America chooses not to lead and not to influence, our allies don't hold together and have significant coherence in combating the major powers that don't have their interests at heart. So we have good allies in Japan. We've got a new leadership in India that could be somewhat of a counterbalance to these trends, but there's no replacement for an American vision and American commitment to hold these places together to balance these other revisionist powers.
Stephen, we elected a man in 2008 who turned his attention to the United States. We re-elected him overwhelmingly in 2012. The American people have chosen. Have they turned their backs on East Asia? Have they turned their backs on East Europe? Let's be sensible about this. You can't push a river. Has America decided we're going to pull up the gates and not concern ourselves with the world as we did in the second half of the 20th century?
I think that is the dominant trend in our current politics. And unfortunately, if we look back over history, we have these cycles, I would consider them to be temptations, where we turn inward, and there's a compelling logic to turn inward. We have problems at home. We do have to focus on some of them. But what happens is usually developments will break out in the world, and a crisis will awaken us, and we are a mighty force once so provoked. But it takes something terrible to turn that tide, whether it's a Pearl Harbor or a 9/11 or something like that. We don't wish to get to that point again, and that's the great difficulty. There's huge political incentive at home to basically focus inward and leave international matters to sort themselves out. But we have a major internationalized economy, and we will have our interest provoked to a degree where we have to come in a crisis very expensively and maybe with great destruction if we wait too long.
Gordon, I'll put it to you. Are we going to fight for Vietnam in 2014?
Well, maybe not 2014, and it may not be Vietnam, but we are going to get dragged into some sort of armed conflict in East Asia. And it's largely because of that dynamic that we've just been talking about, that the more you try to avoid being engaged in a conflict, that's the best way to end up in a war. And what we don't want to do right now is what has to be done, which is to make it very clear to the Russians and the Chinese that this aggression has to stop and that the U.S. will stop them. If we're not willing to say that, we will end up in war.
Stephen, you're very close to the voters. You've just gone through an election, and you'll go through another one. And so I ask you, intuitively, do you believe the voters are ready for the President of the United States to tell them that we're going overseas to fight for the Vietnamese or the Japanese or the Filipinos?
No, I think right now we're very far from that, but that ultimately is the responsibility of our commander-in-chief. We only have one at a time, and it is the duty of presidents to prepare countries, to tell us the truth, to work with the congressional leadership, and to make sure we have resources necessary in place to deal with contingencies. But it's really the job of the president to prepare the country, and absent that kind of preparation, it's not a shock to me that left to its own devices, the body politic turns inward.
And Gordon, Beijing can see this. So can Moscow. Our conduct in Ukraine indicates that we're not going to fight for anybody.
Well, certainly they can see this, but I think there's also a very difficult political situation in Beijing right now where it doesn't really almost matter what we think, because you have civilians and you have military officers fighting with each other, and that means the system completely is not responding to the normal incentives. That's very dangerous.
Stephen, you went through in the vice president's time that first incident before the war on terror, early in 2001, early in the Bush administration, when the Chinese acted bloody-mindedly. Did we learn that they back down, or when we push back, or did we learn that they get more aggressive when we push back?
Oh, I think that we learned the wrong lessons from that exchange. We learned many different ways to apologize and move on to other issues. In general, though, when the United States is held firm, the Chinese will find a way to work with us because they do need us greatly still.
Stephen Yates, he worked in the Vice President's office. He's Chief Executive Officer of DC International Advisory. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com. I'm John Batchelor.